Welcome to the channel. I am BudsterBrown, here to offer casuals and critics a perspective on cinema. Today, doing October's 31 on 31, The New Breed. Yeah, I like part 7 as well. And once again, for those who don't know, I did not come up with this series. This is helmed by Cody Leach, Bryan Lomax, Chandler, Wiliscredia, and Gen X Reviews. I am just a spectator of their channels. Thought I would join in this time like I did on the May 31 on 31. Had a great time. Thought I'd do it again. They should have already released their videos on this topic, and the link to those videos will be in the description. And for those who don't know, 31 on 31 is where we rank 31 movies that fall under a particular theme, today being modern horror directors, the up-and-coming greats that we are seeing. And the nice thing about taking the best up-and-coming horror directors and ranking their movies is that there's not a whole lot of crap on this list. That means that my rankings aren't based off of a very qualitative scale necessarily, more so just my personal preferences, which for horror is generally tension, scares, gore, whatever you want to call it, mixed with the rewatchability, and then finally you have a compelling narrative that connects with me one way or another. All of the movies that we are ranking today are currently on screen. If you want to join in on the fun, comment down below and tell me how you would rank the movies that you've seen on this list. So without further ado, let's hop into this year's 31 on 31. Like I did with the last 31 on 31, I like to put these movies into qualitative tiers, with our first tier being Yawn of the Dead, which is pretty self-explanatory. Movies that just kind of bored me for one reason or another, or just something that just really didn't click with me. Our number 31 is Teton, where a young woman with a titanium plate in her head embarks on a violent journey of identity, trauma, and transformation. Charles, are you the reason this is on the list? Why? This is Julia Ducournau's first film on this list. I really hope that's how you pronounce it. Probably not. And she is a French horror director that's been getting a lot of buzz with her movie Raw that will be seen later in this list, and of course, Teton. And dog, when I say that there is a movie that is designed for me to hate, this is about as close as you can possibly get. It's very overtly sexual and explicit, which generally I just don't like to see in movies that much, even if it's thematically relevant, which I would say it kind of is here. You essentially have a girl who is a serial killer that gets impregnated by a car. I'm not joking. And then impersonates someone's missing son so that she could hide out, but he knows it's not his son, but he's lonely. He's a fire captain. You know the gist. It's a really weird movie. And I know a lot of you are gonna say, bro, you just didn't get it. You just want to watch another MCU movie. And yeah, I do. You're right. But I also do feel like I understand what it was going for with its themes of identity, reacting to loss, trauma, and sort of just having a cold upbringing and not having healthy relationship with males, gender identity. There's a lot of ideas that are just being thrown at the wall. I don't think that a girl having sex with a car is the best avenue to explore that. It's not one that I enjoyed exploring. It's just something that didn't come together even after I thought about its themes and how they presented it. And more importantly, it's just kind of boring. It's not paced super well, so there's a big kind of chunk in the middle where it focuses mostly on character work. I wasn't invested in the characters, except for that fire captain who actually I did kind of like, I'll admit that. Overall, this movie is just not for me. I don't think I'll ever rewatch it. I don't know who I would even recommend it to. I guess if you like weird artsy French films, it's for you. My number 30 is Dead Silence, where a widower returns to his hometown to unravel the mystery of his wife's gruesome murder linked to a malevolent ventriloquist's doll. This is James Wan's first movie on the list. You're not gonna see him again for a while, and I feel like he's done a little dirty. I've always loved him as a filmmaker, with Saw 1, Insidious, and the Conjuring movies being my go-to picks for his horror films, none of which are on this list. I get that they've ranked it on previous 31 on 31s, and so they don't want to re-include them. However, those are his best movies in my opinion. But where I didn't like Teton because it was super weird and out there, it just did not come together. I dislike Dead Silence for the complete opposite reasons, and where it's really generic, cookie cutter, feels like a mix of like Insidious in The Ring. A lot of the scares felt so obvious, and none of the characters felt like real fleshed out human beings. I did like Mark Wahlberg's brother in this movie, movie as this sort of detective dude. I thought he was an entertaining presence, but outside of that, I can't think of any standout performances in this movie. You know where it's going right from the beginning all the way to the end, and in some ways that can be a little bit comforting because there's a lot of weird movies on this list, and sometimes it's just nice to sit back and relax and just watch something comfortable and cozy that you're familiar with. But this one is just a little bit too familiar for me. My number 29 is Midsommar, where a grieving woman joins her boyfriend on a trip to a remote Swedish village where a strange and terrifying festival spirals into chaos. This is Ari Aster's first movie on this list, and it's actually my least favorite Ari Aster movie. I'm actually, weirdly enough, a fan of Beau is Afraid, and Hereditary will pop up much later in this list. Saying that Midsommar is pretentious is like the biggest understatement ever. This movie feels like it thinks it's so smart and it's so clever, and it's got this quirky confidence to it where Ari Aster is like, yeah, I'm him. This is the movie of the century. And it's really not. Despite its weirdness of people being incredibly high all of the time, it's actually a pretty stereotypical cult film where you have a group of friends show up and then they start dying off and one of them gets indoctrinated into the cult. Where I have issues with it is that these feel like some of the most unrealistic human beings I've ever seen in my entire life. Not one of their character motivations felt in this reality, and I'm sure some of you people like that at home. The thing that it has going for it is because Ari Aster is so confident in himself after making Hereditary, a lot of that bleeds through on the screen, and he has some reasons to be confident. This movie is amazingly shot. The performances are immaculate. And I think there are some interesting themes about the pros and the cons of Community. I heard Ari Aster describe this film as somewhat of a breakup movie, and I kind of like that he went that direction with it. But the problem is, it's pretty obvious where it's going. It's really slow and boring. It's not that weird despite the screen waving around like you're in some massive trip. And when I finished it, I'm like, I must have missed something. I must have not got it. And it was like, no, I got it. It just wasn't that interesting. Man, this movie is just not for me. My number 28 is Terrifier, where on a Halloween night, a sadistic clown named Art embarks on a brutal killing spree targeting two young women. This is Damien Leone's first movie on this list, and don't worry, we got the other two Terrifier movies on their way. However, this movie didn't really work for me. I didn't really like the plot here, or the lack of plot here. It's basically Art the clown shows up on a Halloween night, kills two people, and sort of maims another one, and that is the extent of the plot. They do have a little bit of a full circle moment with the interview at the movie being actually at the end of the movie. That's not phrased the best, but if you've seen it, you know what I mean. When I'm watching a movie with this much brutal violence, I kind of like a plot to sort of balance that out, to help bring some levity to these scenes and having characters that I like and root for. This movie doesn't really have any of that. I would say the one person that does bring levity is ironically the psycho killer Art the Clown. David Howard Thornton is so great in this role. He embodies Art the Clown so well, and I can see why he's becoming this massive horror slasher icon, and I think he gets even better as the movies go along. But outside of his performance, some fantastic gore effects, and a fun grindhouse feel, Terrifier 1 really has nothing going on for me to like. My number 27 is Longlegs, which details two detectives chasing down a Satan-worshipping serial killer. This was actually the first movie that I watched once I heard 31 on 31 was happening, and I was really excited for it. Not only is it directed by Oz Perkins, aka Norman Bates' son, it was getting a ton of positive buzz. It's an independent horror film, and it has my goat, Nicolas Cage, as the main antagonist of the movie. That is a recipe for a W, and I was a little bit let down and disappointed. Director Oz Perkins' approach to horror seems to be one centered on subtlety. In some ways, that makes it a pretty refreshing film to watch. Perkins really lets this movie breathe, and he slowly reveals plot elements to you as the movie goes on, and if you're paying really close attention, you can kind of figure out what's going on, where the plot's going. Bringing in Nicolas Cage is a good idea because he gives a great performance in this movie. Unfortunately, it wasn't a scary one to me. I was very rarely unsettled by him at all because I just saw goofy Nick Cage, and there is just no escaping that, despite him giving a good performance. And due to his subtle approach in horror, Longlegs just feels kind of boring and slow. And also just a movie that brings in a lot of familiar horror ideas and presents it in a great way. This movie is impeccably shot, but didn't feel original, didn't capture my mind's interests. It just was very underwhelming. It could just be that it was overhyped, but either way, it doesn't rank very high when compared to the rest of these movies. And my number 26 is The Black Coat's Daughter, where two girls left behind at their boarding school over winter break face a mysterious evil force while a troubled woman heads towards them. And this is Oz Perkins' second film, and unfortunately his last film on this list. And I do like this a little bit more than Longlegs. Like I said, Oz Perkins is very centered on subtlety, and I think that shines a little bit better here. I do appreciate how he lets this movie breathe, and he subverts your expectations by taking what you as a horror fan, as an audience member, know and expect from either cult horror, religious horror, possession horror, and sort of flipping it on its head. There is a ton of subtle swerves here that I can really appreciate. I also love how so much of this movie is communicated without needing to say anything. Oz Perkins really seems to trust the audience here, that they can figure out what's going on. And I also like this execution of a theme of loneliness and how we cope with loss, and how maybe we get involved with the wrong type of person in an attempt to just not be alone at all. I also find the tension in this movie to be pretty good, and I was genuinely unsettled at times. The problem with this movie is that it is so subtle that I found myself really bored. Yes, this movie breathes. I love breathing room in movies. A little bit too much breathing room. There's also a non-linear plot here that didn't work as well for me as it has for a lot of other people. While I do think they play with your expectations well, the general beats of this movie I predicted very early. I predicted a lot of the swerves that they had here that I don't want to spoil for you if you haven't seen the movie, because I do think it's worth a watch, and I have heard a great many people be surprised by the twist in this movie, so to speak. And I've always said that the difference between a good twist and a bad twist is whether or not you could predict it. And depending on who you are or what twists you predict will affect how quality you think the movie is and is not. I guess lastly, I didn't really care about any of these characters that much. They were fine. I wasn't annoyed by a single one of them, but I wasn't caring about their journeys that much either. While I appreciate so much of this movie, and I think they do a lot of cool things, I was generally very uninvested. My number 25 is Oculus, where two siblings try to prove that an antique mirror is responsible for the death and misfortune that has plagued their family. This is Mike Flannigan's first movie on this list, acclaimed director of The Haunting of Hill House, and I see a lot of what he did in that show being brought into Oculus, where you basically have this family that suffered a great tragedy due to some sort of supernatural haunting, and then them coming back to the scene of the crime years later to try and resolve whatever happened. And I think my favorite element of this movie is the first half, where this brother and sister return to that place where they were haunted with the antique haunted item and try to outsmart it based off of years of research on how people died to this thing. They took a very scientific, methodical approach to it. And I thought that was really interesting. And if the rest of this movie was like the first half, this movie would have jumped up way higher on the list. Unfortunately, it just devolves into generic horror haunting territory in the back half of the movie, and it also just gets kind of boring. You see, a lot of information is explained to us in the first half, which is already a little exposition heavy, but I allow it because it was still interesting. The second half is them constantly jumping back to this haunting to show us things that we basically already knew, but it's trying to recontextualize it, but I don't think that it adds anything that interesting. And so what we end up getting is this kind of disjointed plot of two movies that tells the same thing, and this movie also suffers from one of my least favorite tropes in in horror, which is where you cannot at all trust reality. It's like they came up with this great plan to stop the deity, and then it's like, well, the deity can control every perception in your mind, so any plan you come up with is going to fail. And so I just find myself uninvested. I'm like, well, what's the point of even watching this anymore? It's pretty clear they're not going to triumph. That tension for me immediately vanished in that second half, while also being kind of generic, while also being like two movies at once that kind of intersect and kind of don't. Very disappointing. But that first half is so interesting that it gets a lot of points. My number 24 is Crawl, where a daughter fights for her life alongside her injured father in their flooded Florida home, besieged by hungry alligators during a hurricane. This is Alexandre Aja's first movie on this list, and if I could just describe solid as a movie, this is that. It follows a pretty basic structure from beginning to end. The characters are solid, the scares are solid, the plot is okay. I feel like it took itself maybe just a little too seriously. When you have 25 alligators swarming your home as the water keeps rising and rising, I think that's an interesting setup for tension, but if you had just imbued a little bit of camp into this movie, it would have been better. Unfortunately, it didn't do that, and because of it, I'm just left like, yeah, that was fine, moving on. My friends, we have made it to our next qualitative tier, which is A Bloody Time, no alcohol required. Shout out Jeremy Jones, OG in the game. It's basically how it sounds, a solid time with some great ideas, and is maybe just held back by a couple of things that didn't work for me. My number 23 is Raw, which follows a young vegetarian at a veterinary school who develops an insatiable craving for human flesh after a hazing ritual goes wrong. This is Julia Ducournau's second and last film on the list, and initially, this was close to the bottom. It might have even been at the bottom, but the more that I thought about this movie, the more that I let it marinate in my brain, I decided that this movie kind of rocks. Unlike Titan, I think this movie is actually pretty well paced. I like how the events unfold. I like how the twists and reveals are built up to throughout the course of the movie. I like how it uses cannibalism to explore these themes of a loss of innocence, being peer pressured to do things, wanting to fit in, also wanting to be different. It's a coming of age story in a very weird way, but it's one that I sort of weirdly connect to. I promise I'm not a cannibal, but for some reason, this movie did land with me. Now, that being said, it suffers from some of the same things I don't like about Titan, which is just very overt and blatant sexual material. And I know it's from France. I know they do things a little bit differently over there, but I don't usually just like seeing titties on screen for like 5 minutes. That's just not my thing. This is also very much a girl movie where they're like waxing each other and you're getting into that mind of a woman. And I think that's great, but I'm not a woman, so it's like one of those things where there's some elements I don't connect with as much. And lastly, I don't think that it fully connects its themes of cannibalism to the story. Like, I think in some movies there's like perfect metaphors to where the physical thing happening perfectly relates to the mental struggles that are happening, and you can really tie that in very tightly. I don't think that the cannibalism element worked here. But that being said, I think this one turned out to be really fun, and I always like when there's a movie that I just had such a shocking reaction to that I can come around later and be like, you know what? That was pretty baller. My number 22 is Smile, where a doctor becomes haunted by terrifying visions after witnessing a traumatic incident, which seems to be linked to a sinister curse passed from victim to victim. This is Parker Finn's first movie on the list. Now, I've already shared my detailed thoughts on Smile 1 and Smile 2, which you can find right here in this corner. But to give you my brief thoughts, I find this to be a very solid clone of 2003's The Ring, where you basically have someone who is caught this evil curse that you can only survive by passing it on to someone else, and I think it does that relatively effectively. I wasn't super impressed by the visuals in this movie, but I think that the concepts are executed pretty well. I kind of like the lore, how it's set up. There's a bit of an originality factor here that I think it has over Smile 2. 2. Due to the nature of this being the first movie, I think it can keep you guessing whether or not our protagonist beats the smile demon or not. At the same time, I don't find it particularly scary, but I do think it is incredibly solid, and I thoroughly enjoyed myself when I watched it in theaters for the first time. My number 21 is Smile 2, which continues the psychological horror of its predecessor, expanding on the nightmarish curse and its devastating consequences. Parker Finn's second and last entry on this list, and I feel basically the same about Smile 2 as I do about Smile 1, where it's a solid Ring clone. And while the impact isn't as strong for me as the first one, because it's a clone of the first one, which is a clone of the Ring in my opinion, this one is much more competently directed than Smile 1. Parker Finn has clearly evolved himself. He's clearly more confident in what he's able to create, and I think there's some truly creative sequences in this movie, and Naomi Scott, she performs her butt off in this movie. She does such a great job, and I find her portrayal as Sky Riley to be much more engaging than the protagonist of the first movie, as they play with her life situation and why people won't believe her very, very well. I found myself much more engaged in the story. However, it is a more disappointing movie. I was really hoping that they were going to expand off the lore of the first one and go in a bit of a different direction, but it relatively follows that same template and just tries to make it better. But because it's basically the same movie, it can't go any higher than 21. My number 20 is Ouija Origin of Evil, where a widow and her daughters unwittingly invite a dark spirit into their home through a fraudulent Ouija board scam. This is Mike Flannigan's second and last film on this list, and funny story, I watched the first Ouija movie on my honeymoon, and I was like, why did I watch that trash? And so when Ouija Origin of Evil appeared on this list, I'm like, a sequel or prequel to that movie that was garbage? Why is this here? But after watching, I gotta say, Mike Flannigan did a really good job of taking this mediocre, generic haunting movie that would have been at the bottom of this list if it was on it, and transforming it into something much more interesting. For one, I think the performances in this movie are pretty good, especially when you consider that there's a child actress that plays a very key role in this movie, where she has to have the range of being a sweet little girl, but then also a demon. She plays that really well. I also just like this concept of slowly succumbing to this evil and playing off of people's tragedy and grief just to get money out of them. I feel like we see that a lot in the real world, and while it's not a super deep theme, it is a simple one that is executed quite effectively. And there's also this preacher in the movie who figures out what's going on with this possessed little girl who's taking advantage of people, and I really like the way that he did it. It felt reminiscent of that first half of Oculus that I really like, where they were outsmarting the deity. This would have probably been a little higher if I thought the last act was a little bit better. Once again, we go into sort of generic haunting territory, but it's extremely well paced. It doesn't overstay its welcome, and it knows what it is. It's not pretentious in the slightest, and I can really appreciate a solid haunting movie like this one. My number 19 is Infinity Pool, where a couple discovers a nightmarish underworld of hedonism, violence, and bodily horror while on a vacation at a luxurious resort. This is Brandon Cronenberg's first movie on the list, who is the son of esteemed horror-director David Cronenberg, which I actually haven't seen any of his movies, to be quite honest, so this is my first introduction to the Cronenbergisms. I don't know if his son directs movies like his dad, but if so, David is a weirdo, because Brandon goes all out in this movie, making something that is incredibly unique, interesting, tackles some themes that I like in a non-overt and subtle way. And what I think makes Brandon Cronenberg a horror director to look out for is not only his practical gore body horror effects, but also just how he mixes sci-fi and horror into the narrative to make this unique blend of this interesting sort of high concept movie. Similarly to Raw, Infinity Pool was a movie that was at the bottom of of the list at some point. I just didn't like it. I was actually in a bad mood when I first watched it, and I was like, another one of these weird, trippy horror movies. I can't even with this one. But that's not really the movie's fault, because the next morning I woke up and I was like, that movie was kind of cooking though. For one, I actually do think it's pretty well paced. The performances in this movie are really great. Of course, you have Mia Goth, who has just been killing it in Ty West's X trilogy, which will be appearing later on this list. But Alexander Skarsgård brings it in this movie as James Foster. I thought that him playing this somewhat beta male rich guy and seeing how he transforms over the movie, while they explore so many themes of rich people never having to face their consequences, masculinity, and how that can affect your confidence, I thought was very well done, while never having this speech about capitalism's bad, we live in a society, or whatever. It was just baked into the plot. I feel like by design it's meant to sort of shock you and you're not really supposed to get it, but after watching it, I was like, this is a well-crafted film with great gore effects where I was deeply unsettled. The only reason this movie isn't higher is, for one, I'm not really itching to rewatch it. I feel like I got everything the first time, and unless I'm wanting to show a friend, I don't think that I'm going to just enjoy checking it out and turning it on every now and then. I also didn't enjoy it while I watched it, and while I think I would enjoy it more if I watched it again, I can't be 100% sure that's the case, because I didn't watch it again because I'm on a bit of a time crunch, because I decided to wait till the last second to watch all these movies. And once again, this movie is so overtly explicit and sexual. While I think it works with the plot, I just personally don't like that stuff as much. But I thought this movie was really well crafted, had a lot for my brain to gnaw on after the movie's credits rolled. My number 18 is Possessor, where an assassin uses brain implant technology to control others and execute high-profile targets, but struggles with losing her own identity. Brandon Cronenberg's back again for the last time, and I think part of the reason why I like this movie more than Infinity Pool is because I watched Infinity Pool first, and so it kind of primed me for that Cronenberg style. I knew what I was walking into, but beyond that, I just think this is a more interesting direction to me. I think this movie subtly explores many themes of identity, losing yourself to play a character, how we all play a character for people that we talk to. And I think that's actually illustrated greatly in one of my favorite scenes of the movie, where she's going home after impersonating someone, killing their target, and she's just reciting like, oh, I'm so hungry, but she wants it to sound normal. And as someone who is constantly reciting lines over and over to prepare for these YouTube videos, and in fact, that thing you just heard me say, I have recited over and over and over again to get the inflections just right for the audience, I can relate to that a lot. There's this connecting tissue, this sort of tangibility that I was able to grasp from this movie, while also having a pretty cool sci-fi concept of impersonating people to kill high-profile targets. And I think there's also great themes and ideas of how corporations want you to give everything you have, your entire soul, to the job, and in the process you actually lose that grounded human connection with your family. And the things holding this movie back are very similar to Infinity Pool. It's not super rewatchable. It is overtly sexual, but not nearly to the degree of Infinity Pool. And another issue I have with it that I don't think Infinity Pool suffered from as much is I just feel like it was a pretty slow burn. It takes its time. I feel like you could have shaved off a couple minutes for sure, and it would have helped it flow a lot better. But overall, I think it was a greatly executed film, and I connected with it a lot. My number 17 is Terrifier 2, featuring the return of Art the Clown, who targets a teenage girl and her brother on Halloween night, unleashing a wave of brutal, nightmarish violence. This is Damien Leone's second film on this movie, and Terrifier 2, while certainly being not as well paced as Terrifier 1, there's actually some plot here and some characters for me to connect with, and due to that, I appreciate it more. I also just like how unhinged and off the wall this movie is. Like, Damien put in a 5-minute dream sequence of Clown Cafe singing. It's weird, it's kind of out there, but I kind of like it. That's the biggest thing Terrifier 2 does better than Terrifier 1. There is some lore here for me to think about, which just by nature gets me more invested in the characters. characters. And I also like our lead, Sienna. I think that she is one of the best final girls I've seen in slasher movies in a long time, probably since Mia from Fede Alvarez's Evil Dead remake. Lauren Lavera is such a talented up-and-coming actress, and I can't wait to see her do more outside of the Terrifier franchise. And once again, David Howard Thornton back as Art the Clown, doing his Art the Clown thing, but doing it even better than he did in Terrifier 1. The kills are better here, with the most gruesome one being that famous bedroom scene. Y'all know what I'm talking about. And that was the scene that almost made me tap out of this movie, because it was just too much for me. I couldn't even look at it half of the time. It was so gruesome. But if you're a gorehound, that's what you came here for. And seeing Art the Clown get, spoiler alert, decapitated at the end of this movie was pretty satisfying for me after seeing him do all that up shit, okay? So I was at least glad to see that. And you know what? I can appreciate a weird, ballsy, audacious slasher from time to time. My number 16 is MaXXXine, which follows the events of X and Pearl, continuing Maxine Minx's journey into the 1980s as she strives for fame in Hollywood. Ty West's first movie on this list, and I gotta say, it was a lot of fun. It has a little bit of that grindhouse 80s aesthetic that I think is just very fun to look at. I think Mia Goth plays Maxine really great in this movie. In fact, I think this is the most likable version of the character for me, and it's the one that I latched on to the most. You see a little bit of an evolution of her character since what happened to her in X, and it makes perfect sense after what happened in that movie. I also like how this is a little bit of an inverse of X, where she's trying to be a porn star that ends up being in a horror movie, and now she's a porn star who's trying to be in a horror movie. And I like how they sort of played with that idea in this movie. Another thing I think is good is the whodunit element just makes for a fun time, and the characters in this movie are generally likable. Where this movie falls apart for me is the last act, where it's still fun. It didn't ruin the movie for me, but it didn't tie a bow on the X trilogy in a way that I think is super satisfying. However, other than that, man, fun time, good gore, good kills. Ty West just makes movies that I just enjoy a lot, even if I can't fully articulate why that is. My number 15 is Abigail, which follows a group of mercenaries as they kidnap and watch over a little girl for 24 hours. This is the first movie directed by Matt Bettinelli Olpin and Tyler Gillette, and if you've seen the movie and heard that description, you'll know that there's a little element that I left out there. And if you don't want to know what that element is, if you've never heard of this movie, skip ahead 10 seconds, and that is that it is a vampire story. That little girl they kidnapped is a vampire, and I think that this movie is a ton of fun. I think that there's a lot of great gore effects and kills. There's a lot of likably unlikable. I like the haunted house setting. I think the performances are entertainingly cheesy. If they played this movie perfectly straight, it would kind of suck, but they know what it is. They imbue a lot of camp into it, and that leads to some fun, dark humor moments. Where this movie suffers for me is it sort of falls apart in the last act just a little bit. It's still okay. It felt like the characters were very protected all of a sudden from a lot of plot armor, and that's not as satisfying for me as a viewer. However, it was a pretty fun time. I thoroughly enjoyed myself. My number 14 is The Exorcism of Emily Rose, where a priest stands trial for manslaughter after a young woman dies during an exorcism while her story is recounted in flashbacks. This is Scott Derrickson's first movie on this list, and it's certainly an interesting and unique one. The majority of this movie takes place in a courtroom, and don't worry, it's not as bad as Joker 2 if you've seen it, but I like how they recap a lot of these events of this exorcism, allowing the audience watching this movie to feel sort of like jury members judging the trial of this case. And I watched it with my brother, and he was actually on the opposite side of the trial than I was, and so it was kind of cool to see all of the facts and evidence taking place right in front of our eyes. This movie is incredibly acted. I think it has a very compelling story and themes that it pulls off. The thing that's holding it back for me, though, is it's not really that scary. I like the story. I wouldn't mind rewatching it with someone, but dog, I didn't jump like once, maybe once. But that's it. It also feels like it's a little bit too long. I feel like you could have shaved off a couple of minutes and this movie would have flowed much better. Other than that, though, I really enjoyed this one, and it certainly surprised me. My number 13 is Never Let Go, which follows a desperate mother and her 2 sons who try to avoid the evil that surrounds their secluded home. This is Alexandre Aja's, I'm sorry, I don't know how to say your name, dude, second movie, and to me, I liked it a lot more than Crawl. Unfortunately, I didn't watch it in theaters though, so I had to spend $20 to see it, and honestly, I'm kind of glad that I own the movie. I think that this is an interesting psychological movie where they explore the idea whether someone is just crazy or if there really is this evil possession going on, and the movie smartly never tells you definitively whether or not if it is just mental illness or if there really is some evil lurking. And I think it could be fun, if I knew anyone that actually saw this movie, to debate with them whether or not which one is actually the case. Moreover, I think the performances in this movie are really good. Halle Berry's in this movie, and she does a great job playing this sort of unhinged mother. She does a good job towing that line of, is she crazy? Do we believe her, or is she right? And even though at the very end there's things to suggest that she might be right, there's also things to suggest she might be wrong. I think I was especially impressed with the performances of her sons though, specifically the one that starts doubting everything going on. Like, maybe there isn't this evil surrounding my home. While this movie is reminiscent of other projects I've seen, like M. Night Shyamalan's Village comes to mind, which is a pretty crazy movie, I still think that it has a lot of unique aspects to it, where it takes a lot of these other movies' ideas and fuses it together to make something that feels original and fun to watch. I will say it's a little slow, not super rewatchable, and I think another little issue is that no matter what perspective you have on this movie, is there's always going to be holes in it. If you think it's all in their head, you can say, well, this happened, so how could it be in their head? And if you think that it's evil, then it's like, well, this is happening, so how could that not be in their head? I wish there was a way that you could think of this movie as concretely one or the other, that they could both coexist. But that being said, I had a great time with this movie. I was shocked how much I liked it. My number 12 is Ready or Not, where a bride's wedding night turns into a deadly game of hide and seek when her in-laws force her to participate in a twisted family ritual. This is our second and last movie directed by Matt Bettinelli-Olpin and Tyler Gillette. I just thought this movie was a ton of fun. It was super tightly paced. I thought our lead was extremely charismatic, and it just had this like cozy Halloween vibe where it wasn't afraid to be campy. And as you know, as a fan of Sam Raimi, I should even say, I love camp, and I think it was done very effectively here. Things holding it back is, once again, it's not super scary because it is funny, and there's not really any super profound, deep themes. I mean, most people have problems with their in-laws, am I right? But it takes that idea to a extreme level, and I think that that's pretty fun. And my friends, we have reached our last qualitative tier, which is all killer, no filler. These are what I consider to be the best of these movies. And yeah, sure, I might still have some problems with these movies, but overall, I just think that they are great horror experiences that I don't take many issues with. And to start off our all killer, no filler tier is number 11, which is Terrifier 3. Art the Clown returns once more to spread mayhem, terrorizing a new group of victims in his most brutal chapter yet, and to top it off, he does it during Christmas. This is Damien Leone's third and final entry on this list, and when it comes to Terrifier movies, this is by far my favorite. It is very violent, and there's a ton of violence in this movie, but none of them quite top that bedroom scene. I would still say this is just the goriest of them by proxy of there just being more vicious kills. And I kind of hate it for that, but I also kind of like it. You know, horror movies should take you back. Murder should be horrible. It should be, well, terrifying. And this movie did offer me that. I watched it in theaters with a packed crowd of Terrifier 3 fans, and seeing the different reactions and feeling the energy in the room made for an incredibly impactful experience. And seeing some people walk out and never return, and other people's look like they're about to vomit while someone else is laughing, that range of expression was super fascinating to me. And I've done a review/reaction of this movie, which you can check out in this corner right here. But It's the basic stuff of David Howard Thornton once again, Art the Clown, super great in the role. I thought this was his best performance yet. They play with the Christmas setting very well. Lauren Lavera as Sienna is a great final girl once again. I like the evolution of her character in this movie, and overall I think it is very well paced. I would even say it's the best paced of all of the Terrifier movies. There are issues with this movie. It's not super plot heavy. Some of the characters can be pretty annoying, but when I'm walking into a slasher movie, I'm not expecting cinematic excellence. I'm expecting a bloody, gory time that offsets me a little bit, and that's what Terrifier 3 did very well. And kicking off the top 10 is Nope, where a brother and sister discover something sinister lurking in the sky above their family's California ranch, threatening to consume everything. This is Jordan Peele's first movie on the list, and I gotta say, it's quite the strong showing. Just to get the simple stuff out of the way, the camera work in this movie is incredible. Visually, it might be my favorite of all of Jordan Peele's movies. I just think that it captures that Alien, E.T., Jaws aesthetic really well. You can tell that Jordan Peele has such a passion for horror movies, and I love all of the different influences that he imbued into this film. I also like the ambiguous nature of the creature/alien in this movie. That plays into the themes of people are always trying to see stuff that they really shouldn't. Also have some effectively scary moments, like when this creature is surrounding their ranch and it feels like there's no escape. There's a scene with a monkey at the beginning of this movie that I also think is effectively eerie and does set up the movie's themes pretty well. I also always like when people analyze the experiences they've had and sort of put it all together to defeat whatever creature they're fighting. They do that in this movie, and I thought it was pretty great. I feel like it could have been a little bit shorter, it could have been a little bit scarier, and while it's rewatchable, I feel like the other movies ahead are more rewatchable, but that doesn't mean it's bad. I think it is a super great time. It is truly killer. No filler. My number 9 is Malignant, where a woman experiences terrifying visions of gruesome murders, discovering that they are shockingly connected to her dark past. James Wan makes his second and final appearance on this list, which is sad for me because I love him so much, but hey, all good things have to come to an end. And Malignant really shocked me because I expected this movie to kind of suck, and it kind of does, but in like the best way possible. I really love how James Wan knows what you're going to expect from a James Wan haunting possession horror movie. We've all seen Insidious and The Conjuring, and he's like, what if I just went in a completely different direction and subverted all of your expectations by doing something new and unique? I gotta say, he pulled that off really well. I more or less predicted what was going to happen in this movie, but there were certainly things that took me aback and shocked me where I was like, oh, wasn't expecting that, and it is all set up pretty well. And more importantly, I just enjoyed the journey on this movie. It is so fun, and a lot of that is due to just horror camp. You know me, I love a good campy horror movie, and this is about as campy as it can get without just being way too ridiculous for me. The thing pushing this movie to number 9 is definitely the rewatchable factor. Like, I just want to turn this on at a Halloween party and watch it with people because it's just a fun movie that is effectively creepy and does new and interesting things that I can appreciate, that imbues a ton of different horror influences. James Wan is the master, and I think he did a phenomenal job with Malignant. My number 8 is X, where a group of aspiring filmmakers shoots an adult movie on a rural Texas farm where they are stalked by a sinister elderly couple. While I don't think that this movie is particularly unique, it takes a ton of familiar elements from slashers that we love, like Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, you name it, and it throws it all together to make one of the best slashers that I've ever seen. The way this movie is shot reminds me a lot of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, occur. The side characters remind me of the goofy ones from Friday the 13th, and the kills match the brutality of some of the darker Halloween movies while also having a Betsy Palmer, Mrs. Voorhees-esque killer. I think that this movie is just such a love letter to slasher fans, and at this time I was starving for a good slasher film that wasn't David Gordon Green's Halloween trilogy, so this was such a breath of fresh air for me. The movie's funny, it's scary, it's gory, it's everything you want from a slasher, and I would find it very hard to make a slasher better than this movie. My number 7 is Sinister, which follows a true crime writer as he discovers a series of disturbing home videos that lead him to uncover a spiritual entity responsible for a string of murders. This is Scott Derrickson's second and final film on this list, and you know what? Bro had a good showing, so props to him. I had heard a lot about Sinister leading up to this 31 on 31, where I had not seen it yet, and I had heard it was this scary, dark movie that was truly horrifying, and it did not disappoint. It's not campy at all. It's not a fun movie per se, but when the credits rolled, I found myself deeply unsettled, and I had to go over to my relatives right after, and I just remember sitting there in this darkness of what this movie ended up doing. And I think something that scared me about it is where in a lot of these horror movies it feels like, oh, it's pretty obvious what you should do, and that is to just move out of the haunted house. And I'm like, just move, just get out of there. Scott Derrickson knows that that's what you're going to think, and so when that happens, that's when the true horror starts, is when they leave, and he set that up incredibly well, and I did not guess that part. This movie's really good. I could see it easily being your number 1, but just because it shook me to my core so much and just left me with this dark feeling, I don't necessarily want to rewatch it unless I'm just showing someone else, because it is a really competently made horror movie. It's just not a very fun one. My number 6 is Us, where a family's vacation takes a terrifying turn when they are confronted by eerie doppelgangers with deadly intentions. This is Jordan Peele's second movie on the list, and when I first watched Us, I was actually pretty freaked out by it. I think that this is probably Jordan Peele's scariest movie for me, where I found myself chilled to the bone. There's a twist at the end of this movie that I actually didn't see coming, and while I know a lot of people did see it coming, as I said earlier, the difference between a good twist and a bad twist is the one you see coming or not, and I didn't see it coming, which means it was a good twist for me. This movie strikes a really good balance between being really funny and really scary, with a lot of great tension being built up. It's also rewatchable, and I can attest to that because I've actually rewatched it a couple of times at this point. I think the thing holding it back is, while there's a sci-fi element that's pretty fun, there are some serious believability issues with this plot that where when I think about it for 2 seconds, I end up kind of scratching my head a lot. And there's also some high concept stuff that happens near the end where there's this big overarching theme, and while I get what he was going for, it does feel like a little silly and out there. That being said though, I think that this is a really great showing from Jordan Peele, and while I don't think it's as well made as Get Out or even Nope, I do still think it is a great horror film that beats out most of the movies on this list. Kicking off my top 5 is Pearl. Set decades before X, this origin story follows the descent of a farm girl into madness and violence as she dreams of fame and pleasure. This is Ty West's third and last movie on this list, and I gotta say, his X trilogy was one of my favorite things to come out of horror in recent years. I love how much horror variety there is in this trilogy, where if you like any of these movies more than the other, if you rank it in any way, I completely understand. It is a matter of taste, and for my tastes, Pearl is kind of what I'm looking for, which is a sort of weird out there movie that has cool things to say that isn't too weird and out there, and is an exploration of this deeply broken and psychotic character being Pearl. And I love how the movie's Wizard of Oz-esque aesthetics contrasts so much with the darkness found within, and Mia Goth displays that darkness so well. While I like her more as MaXXXine in the movie MaXXXine, I think this is by far her best performance, especially with this one monologue near the end where she talks about being sick and being a bad person. And I like how it's kind of a twist on a Hallmark movie where it's like the girl wants to leave her safe farmland and go to the city and become a big popular star, you know, a classic rags to riches story, and it just doesn't go her way, and it probably shouldn't because she's a crazy, psychotic lunatic. The way that they explore that and put us inside Pearl's head, it was just fascinating for me. I was on the edge of my seat the entire movie. I was never bored. This is a great horror movie that I find myself thinking about quite often. My number 4 is Don't Breathe, where a group of friends break into the home of a blind man only to discover that he's far more dangerous than they could have imagined. This is Fede Alvarez's second and final film on this list, and is also the final film I watched for 31 on 31, and that is mainly due to the fact that there were so many weird movies that I watched in succession that turned me off, that I was like, I just want tried and true Fede Alvarez to give me a good experience to bring this list to a satisfying close. And I'm so glad I did that, because this movie impressed me so much. I had not seen it before, but I had high expectations, and it met those high expectations. I think the thing that I appreciate the most about this movie is how it takes something very simple and keeps you invested the whole time, and I think that is aided a lot by the runtime of this movie, which is an hour and 30 minutes, and it doesn't waste any of your time. And even while I was watching it, I was like, wow, I'm really engaged, but I don't know how they're going to keep me engaged without me thinking, why don't the characters just do this or that or whatever? Every character decision felt pretty believable to me. I understand why they couldn't just run out the front door or do this or do that, and I like how they made a blind veteran so dangerous and so incredibly creepy. I can always just appreciate a movie that has a very simple concept and it just executes that really well. It's one of the things I love about John Carpenter's Halloween, and man, this movie delivered. The only thing barring it from the top 3 is that there's not a whole lot of likable characters in this movie. They're all kind of bad people, and I don't mind that. I can still root for them, but it is something where I'm like, yeah, you know, I kind of don't really care if you die sometimes, but the tension is great. The horror is sound. I think this is a more than solid horror experience that Fede Alvarez brought to us. My number 3 is Hereditary, where a family unravels terrifying secrets about their ancestry after the death of their grandmother, leading to tragic and supernatural consequences. Up until this point, I kind of forgot that Ari Aster was on this list because Midsommar was so long ago, but Hereditary is just so good. The first time that I watched it, I was blown away, and I even thought it was the scariest movie I'd ever seen. It's one of those movies where after the credits were rolling and it got dark and I watched it at like 2 a.m. or whatever and I was alone in my room, I was like, I need to say a prayer. It was so disturbing and creepy. Great performances across the board. They take the supernatural possession element to another level while having enough weirdness in there to keep me engaged and make it feel original. Even to this day, when I think back to the movie, I still have these dark, sinister images in my brain. The only thing holding it from going higher for me is just that it is so dark, it is so effective at being a great horror movie that I don't necessarily want to rewatch it that much because I am just so utterly disturbed by it. My number 2 is Alien Romulus, where a new crew faces the horrors of the xenomorphs in deep space as they battle for survival in the latest installment of the Alien franchise. This is Fede Alvarez's second and final appearance on this list, and hey, number 2 ain't bad. Alien Romulus is one of the craziest movies that I've ever seen in theaters. Now, to be fair, I've only seen the first 2 Aliens movies before I watched this, so I don't know how much Fede Alvarez is stealing things that happened before, but for me, it felt like a greatest hits playlist of things that happened in the first 2 Aliens movies, plus a bunch of new, fresh stuff to keep me engaged and keep it from feeling like a rehash. The pacing in this movie is crazy. It never lets up. They put the gas down. It is pedal to the metal till the end of this movie. I think the thing that I was most impressed about, though, is setup in payoff. Every little thing that happens in this movie feels like it was set up by a previous event. And I think that you getting those payoffs to those previous events is super, super satisfying when it comes to a narrative. I also think for me, this is by far the scariest Aliens movie that I've ever seen. Think about Fede Alvarez's Evil Dead remake mixed with Aliens. That's what this is. I was actually jumping throughout this entire movie, especially one jump scare near the end that literally made my heart almost leap out of my chest. I think what I also like about this movie is it's rewatchable because there's a ton of metal moments in it that just makes you go, yes, that's what I'm looking for. And I get that you don't need that. Like I said, you guys might put other movies higher up because they're just more scary, but this is scary, rewatchable, full of tension, but also just great fun performances that feels like it takes the best elements of the Alien franchise, turns it into a film. After watching this movie, it made me realize that Fede Alvarez is probably one of my favorite horror directors working now, and I highly recommend you check out his catalog if you have not already. But my number one is Get Out, where a young black man's weekend with his white girlfriend's family takes a disturbing turn as he uncovers a horrifying secret about their true intentions. This is Jordan Peele's third and last movie on this list, and I remember the first time I saw Get Out, I was completely mesmerized by it. It's one of those few movies that I can point to and say is kind of perfect. I don't even have anything to criticize about it. The pacing is perfect, the performances are perfect, the villains are unlikable, the protagonist is likable, the side character is funny, it's effectively scary, it has good themes. Everything that you would want from a horror movie that would satisfy a wide audience of people is present. It's so fun for me to see someone like Jordan Peele, who I love his comedy skits that he did with Key, go into horror and make a masterpiece on his first attempt. Get Out is kind of the perfect horror movie for me. I love so much about it. I've rewatched it countless times, and every time I do rewatch it, I find something new that I love about it. Get Out is a fantastic film. I have zero flaws with it, and to me, it is the perfect horror movie from the perfect horror director. And hey, you made it to the end of the video. I had so much fun watching all these movies, and while at certain times it was a chore, at the end it is all worth it because I was able to make this video for you guys. And on a little bit of a personal note, I don't want to trauma dump too much. I've been having a bit of a hard time just due to things happening in my life, and being able to distract myself by diving into this YouTube channel and pouring all of my energy into something has been very helpful. So if you guys made it through this whole gauntlet of a video, I really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much to Cody Leach, Chandler, Bryan Lomax, Wiliscredia, and Gen X Reviews for making this video possible. Once again, check their videos out in the link in the description if you haven't already. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you later.